The evening around the cabin was calm, the sky soft and blue, the pine trees whispering in the wind like quiet guards around the valley. But the peace broke when hard knocks slammed against the wooden door again and again, each one louder than the last, like a challenge thrown into the silence. The man inside looked up from the small table where a map and a black notebook lay open. He did not rush. He closed the notebook, folded the map with care, and stood. His face showed no fear, only patience, as if he had expected this moment for a long time. Outside, the HOA president stood on the porch with a stiff smile and a stack of papers gripped in her hand. She wore a sharp blazer and carried herself like a judge delivering a sentence. Without waiting for a welcome, she shouted in a clear but cutting voice that carried across the path and into the trees, "Open the door now. This cabin breaks the rules. You need to leave immediately." Her tone was the kind that did not allow questions. It was made to control. The neighbors heard her. Doors opened. Curtains moved. People stepped onto porches and steps, whispering, pulling their sweaters close, not because the air was cold but because her presence always brought a chill. They knew her style: speak first, threaten second, smile last. The man opened the door with a slow, steady hand. He stood tall in the frame, calm eyes on the woman, a still lake behind him through the window, a lantern burning low on the table inside. "Good evening," he said softly. She took a step forward, heels clicking once on the plank floor, and shook the papers as if they were a sword. "There is nothing good about it," she snapped. "You are in violation. Unauthorized structure, unapproved changes, trespass on common land. Pack your things. I have already called for an officer to escort you off this property." He did not move aside. He did not reach for the papers. He simply watched her as if he were listening to a song he had heard too many times. "You will leave," she continued, louder for the neighbors to hear. "If you do not, the HOA will fine you each day until you do. We will lock access to the trail. We will cut your utilities. We will." He raised a hand just enough for silence to fall. "You brought a lot of words," he said, still calm. "Do any of them tell the truth?" Her cheeks colored, not with shame but with the heat of someone who is not used to being slowed. She thrust the papers at his chest. He did not take them. They bent against him and slid down to the floor. The neighbors gasped softly. A child on a porch clung to his mother's sleeve. A dog barked once and then went quiet, as if even it knew this was not a moment for noise. The president forced a tight smile and took a breath through her nose. "Very well," she said. "I will read it to you like a bedtime story." She began listing clauses and numbers and lines from bylaws old and new, her voice steady and practiced, a weapon she had sharpened for years. While she spoke, the man's eyes did not leave her face. He did not argue. He did not shout. He did not defend. His stillness made the neighbors lean closer. It made the president begin to talk faster, then louder, as if his quiet pulled her into a place she did not control. "Do you understand?" she ended, a hard edge on the last syllable. "You are required to vacate this cabin. Now." The man looked past her shoulder, over the path, across the road, to where the old valley fell into the river bend and rose again to a dark line of oaks. He blinked once, slow, as if measuring distance with his memory. Then he brought his eyes back. "You came here with paper," he said. "But you did not bring permission." She gave a brittle laugh. "Permission? From who? The board is the only permission that matters." He shook his head, very slightly. "You forget," he said, and his voice was almost gentle. "There are older permissions than yours." The neighbors traded glances. Older permissions? What did he mean? The president's smile thinned. She stepped closer, so close that the scent of her perfume pushed into the doorway like smoke. "Listen to me," she whispered, now for him alone. "You think silence keeps you safe. It does not. We can make life very difficult here. I can make it difficult." She tilted her head, pleased by her own threat. He tilted his head the same small degree, but it did not look like surrender. It looked like study. "You came to my door," he said. "You speak as if you own more than your voice." She straightened, called out for all to hear, "This is your final notice." She snapped her fingers at a man in a red jacket standing near the path. He raised a phone and began recording, panning over the cabin, the porch, the man's face, the street of watching neighbors, the tall trees. "Document everything," she said. "When the officer arrives, he will see the record. By then this man will be ready to leave." A murmur moved through the people like wind through grass. The man felt the weight of their eyes. He felt the fear they had carried through years of letters and fines and sticky notes left on doors at night. He felt the way the valley itself held its breath when the president walked its paths. He did not fear her. That was the difference. He stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door quietly shut behind him, then moved to the edge of the steps and looked out over the narrow road and the gathered faces. The evening light caught in his eyes and made them bright. "You all know this cabin," he said, not loud, but clear. "You have walked past it in summer when the wild mint grows by the steps. You have seen its chimney smoke in winter. You have borrowed salt and matches here. You have stood under the eaves when rain came quick." A small laugh, nervous and warm, broke from someone in the crowd. The president turned sharply and hissed, "Quiet." He continued, "You have also stood in lines to pay fines, and you have told your children to be smaller so they would not be seen. You have been taught to think the ground under your shoes belongs to a voice, not to the earth." He paused. The valley held itself still. Down by the bend, a bird lifted and crossed the sky alone. The president clapped slowly once. "And the poetry hour ends here," she said. "Officer will be here in 5 minutes. Pack a bag." He looked at her, not with anger, not with pity, but with a kind of calm she did not understand. "If an officer comes," he said, "he will want to read a different set of papers." She smirked. "What papers? Printout from the internet? A handwritten note from your grandfather? Please." He stepped down from the porch and walked past her without touching her shoulder, yet the space seemed to move her aside. He crossed the packed dirt to the old stump at the edge of the yard where a rusted iron box sat under a flat stone. He lifted the stone with both hands, steady and sure, and the neighbors leaned forward, curious now, caught by the movement like fish by a glimmer. From the box he took a leather folder tied with a faded strap. He did not open it. He only held it, and the way he held it made the president's eyes flicker. "This is not my grandfather's note," he said. "This is not a printout." She forced a laugh again, but it broke in the middle like thin glass. "It doesn't matter what you have," she said too quickly. "The board has authority." The board. A car turned onto the road. The sheriff's SUV rolled to a stop by the mailbox. The neighbors parted in a soft wave. The officer stepped out with the calm weight of someone who had no interest in anyone's theater. The president brightened, lifted her chin, pointed at the man, and began her speech, but the officer held up a hand. He said, flat and polite. "I'll hear both sides." She sputtered, then pasted on the smile she used for ribbon cuttings. "Of course. We have bylaws. We have violations. We have photos." She gestured to the man in the red jacket. The officer nodded once, then turned to the man. "Sir." The man set the leather folder across both palms and offered it forward. "He'll need to read these," he said to the officer, and then to the neighbors. "And when he is finished, we will all understand which rules are older." The officer opened the folder. The pages inside were thick and marked with seals that did not shine like new ink, but like things that had lived many years in the dark and were glad to see daylight again. The president leaned in, then stopped, as if the marks themselves had pushed her back. The officer read without hurry. He read names and dates and boundaries that stretched far beyond the porch and the street and the clubhouse on the hill. He read lines that spoke of water rights and timber, of roads and ridgelines, of the bend in the river where the fog sits in autumn. He closed the folder and looked at the man, then at the president, then at the neighbors who now stood very still. He said to her, "Not unkind, not kind. I think you'll want your board present before you say anything else." She blinked. "Why?" The officer rested a hand on the folder. "Because these papers don't mention an unauthorized cabin," he said. He glanced at the valley, at the long dark oaks. "They mention a deed." And the deed mentions a lot more than a cabin. A breath moved through the crowd like the first wind before rain. The president opened her mouth, closed it, then found one last piece of her old voice and tried to make it stand. "This is a trick," she said. "This is nothing." The officer handed the folder back to the man with care that everyone could see. "It looks like something to me," he said. The man accepted it calmly and said nothing more. He did not need to. The neighbors stared at him with new eyes. The president stared at the road as if it could open and swallow her. The lantern on the table behind the door burned steady. The valley seemed to breathe again, slow and deep, as if a weight had been lifted just enough to let air in. And the evening, which had begun with knocks like a threat, stood now on the edge of a truth that would not fit on the papers in the president's hand. The sheriff's SUV pulled away slowly, its taillights fading down the narrow road, leaving behind a silence heavier than the knock that had started it all. The neighbors lingered outside their homes, whispering in small clusters, stealing glances at the man who still stood calmly near the old stump with the leather folder pressed against his side. His wife appeared on the porch, her hand resting gently on the doorframe, her eyes steady but filled with questions. She did not call out to him. She knew better than to disturb the quiet moment that had settled like a blanket over the valley. The HOA president, however, was not quiet. She stood near the mailbox with her red-jacketed assistant, her face pale but her voice rising again, sharp and brittle. "Don't think this is over," she snapped, her eyes darting to the neighbors who were now less afraid to watch openly. "These old papers mean nothing. The board makes the rules. The community agreed. He cannot stay." Her words rang, but they lacked the iron they once carried. The neighbors did not lower their eyes anymore. They did not turn away. A few even crossed their arms and stood firmer, watching her instead of him. The man finally moved, walking back to the porch with slow, measured steps. He placed the folder on the small wooden table just inside the door, then returned to stand on the steps. His calm gaze swept the street, not confrontational, but unyielding. The president marched toward him again, heels stabbing the dirt, papers clutched so tightly they crumpled. "You think you've won something," she hissed, her voice shaking now, not from anger but from the edge of fear. "But I promise you, I will be back. The board will be back. We will have the law on our side. You cannot stop it." He tilted his head, studying her like one might study a storm cloud rolling in the wrong direction. "You spoke of law," he said quietly. "Do you know what law is older than your board?" His words carried across the crowd of neighbors, making them lean closer. She blinked, thrown off balance by his steady tone, then recovered with a laugh that cracked at the edges. "Older law? Please, don't play riddles. You're just a squatter who found old paperwork." But her eyes betrayed her. She remembered the sheriff's careful hands when he returned the folder, the weight in his voice. The neighbors remembered too. The man did not answer her directly. Instead, he turned to the neighbors who had gathered closer now, their fear thinning like mist under the sun. "How many of you," he asked, voice steady and clear, "have paid fines you did not understand? How many of you have bent your heads when letters came to your doors? How many of you have walked these paths and felt you were trespassers in your own homes?" Murmurs rose, voices breaking free after years of silence. A woman stepped forward, clutching her shawl, her voice trembling. "She fined me for planting roses," she said, her eyes fixed on the president. "Called them unapproved vegetation. I tore them out." An older man nodded sharply. "I was told to repaint my shutters 3 times. Each time, a new color. Each time, another fine." A young father spoke next, his hand gripping the shoulder of his son. "She threatened to take me to court because of a swing set in my yard. My boy cried for weeks." The crowd grew louder, braver, their stories pouring out, years of humiliation tumbling into the open air. The president's face burned red. "These are lies," she shouted. "You all agreed to the bylaws. You signed when you moved here. You gave us the right to enforce them." Her voice cracked as she realized no one flinched. No one lowered their eyes. The man stood silent through it all, his arms crossed loosely, his presence enough to hold the crowd steady. Finally, he spoke again. Agreements made in fear are not true agreements. Power built on threats is not power, it is theft. And what is stolen, he paused, his gaze cutting to the president, can be taken back. The neighbors cheered softly, their voices rising in support. For the first time, the president looked uncertain, her papers trembling in her hands, her words faltering. She turned in frustration to the man in the red jacket, but even he looked uneasy now, his phone hanging at his side instead of recording. She muttered under her breath and stormed off down the path, her heels clicking faster, her shadow smaller than it had ever seemed before. The neighbors watched her go, then turned their eyes back to the man. One brave neighbor stepped forward and asked softly, "Is it true? Do you really own this land?" The man did not smile, but his eyes softened slightly. He rested a hand on the leather folder. "This valley has been in my family longer than any of us have lived here. Every tree, every stone, every trail." He looked around, his voice lowering but carrying strong in the quiet night. Even the ground beneath her feet. Gasps spread through the crowd. Some clapped. Others whispered in awe. The weight of the truth settled in, and with it, a new kind of silence, not fear, but respect. The man turned and stepped back into his cabin, leaving the door half open, the glow of the lantern spilling into the night. The neighbors stood quietly, some nodding to each other, some wiping tears, all realizing that the balance of power in their valley had shifted. The president might return, but her crown was already broken. The community had seen her weakness, and they had seen his strength. The cabin was no longer just a home. It was the heart of something larger, something older, something she could not control. And as the night deepened, the whispers turned into promises. Never again would they let fear rule their valley. The next morning the valley awoke to a strange tension. The sun rose golden over the pines, but the air felt thick, as if it carried secrets. Neighbors stepped outside with their coffee cups, speaking in low tones, their eyes drifting toward the cabin at the edge of the trees. Word of what had happened the night before had spread quickly, how the man had stood calm against the HOA president, how the sheriff had read papers older and heavier than any bylaws, how the president had stormed away in defeat. People who had once bowed their heads when the HOA walked past now lifted their chins, their voices carrying more strength than fear. Yet beneath their whispers lay uncertainty. They knew the president would not let go so easily. She had ruled too long, bullied too many, to allow one night to undo her kingdom. At the HOA clubhouse on the hill, the president gathered her remaining loyal board members. Her face was pale, her eyes ringed with sleepless shadows, but her voice was sharp with fury. She slammed her hand down on the polished oak table. "He humiliated me," she spat, pacing the floor. "He dared to wave old paper in my face and make me look small. Do you know what that means? If the community believes him, we lose control. And if we lose control, we lose everything." One man in a gray suit shifted nervously in his chair. "But what if the papers are real?" The sheriff seemed convinced. Her glare cut through him like glass. "They are tricks. They must be. Old records, forged signatures. He found a way to confuse people. But I will not be beaten by a man in a cabin." She leaned forward, her smile twisting into something cold. "We'll turn the law against him. We'll bury him in lawsuits. We'll tell the community he's a fraud, a squatter who fabricated deeds to scare us. And if that doesn't work, we'll hit where it hurts most, his family." The board members shifted again, some uneasy, others nodding out of habit, too afraid to refuse her. She straightened her blazer, already imagining herself back on the porch of his cabin, this time with officers in tow, this time with victory sealed. Meanwhile, the man sat by the fireplace in his cabin, the leather folder open before him. The papers inside glowed faintly in the morning light, each page marked with seals, signatures, and maps tracing the valley's history. His wife sat across from him, her face thoughtful but worried. "They'll come back," she whispered, breaking the silence. He nodded slowly. "Yes. People like her always return. Fear is the only language she knows." His wife reached across the table, resting her hand over his. "But you have something she doesn't. The truth." And the neighbors saw it with their own eyes. He met her gaze, his calm eyes softening. Truth will stand, but I must be ready when she tries to bury it. Outside, neighbors approached quietly, some bringing baskets of food, others just standing near the steps as if their presence could protect him. A young father, the same man who had once been threatened for building a swing set, stepped forward. "We've been silent too long," he said firmly. "If she comes for you, she comes for all of us." Others nodded, their voices adding to his. "She fined me for planting flowers. She humiliated me at a meeting. She made me afraid to live in my own home." Each confession was another stone added to the wall rising against the president. For the first time, the man saw not just fear in their faces, but fire. By afternoon, the president marched into town hall with a folder of her own. She stormed past the receptionist, demanding to see the county clerk. "I want every deed, every record this man claims to own," she hissed. "And I want proof that they're worthless." The clerk, startled but professional, pulled the archives. Dusty books, sealed envelopes, and bound ledgers were laid across the counter. The president pored through them, her fingers trembling as she turned page after page. The truth glared back at her. The man's claim was real, the land his family's for generations, the rights clear and undeniable. She slammed the book shut, her face burning. "Then we'll find another way," she muttered. "The law is flexible for those who know how to bend it." That evening, the president gathered her allies once more. She told them the story her way, that the man was dangerous, that he was plotting to take everything from them, that he wanted to destroy the HOA entirely. "If we let him," she warned, "he will own us." Fear flickered in their eyes again, the old spell of her words trying to return. She leaned closer, whispering, "We must strike first." But outside her circle, in the quiet homes by the lake, the neighbors' courage grew. They no longer hid their complaints. They whispered plans of resistance, of meetings without her permission, of standing behind the man who had shown them the power of silence and truth. The valley itself seemed to shift. The cabins and trees and winding trails that had once felt like a prison now felt alive, waiting for freedom. As night fell, the man stepped onto his porch. The air was cool, the stars scattered bright across the sky. He heard footsteps and turned to see neighbors gathering with lanterns, their light glowing softly in the dark. One by one they came, until the entire street shimmered with warm flames. No one spoke at first. They only stood with him, shoulder to shoulder, their silence louder than any threat. Finally, the old man with the shutter fines cleared his throat. "We're with you," he said simply. "Whatever comes next, we're not afraid anymore." The man looked over the crowd, his calm eyes shining in the lantern glow. He nodded once, a small gesture, but enough. The valley had shifted. The president might plot in her clubhouse, but her power was no longer absolute. The land itself belonged to him, but tonight, he understood something greater. The people belonged to each other. And for the first time in years, the valley felt alive with hope. The next morning the valley was restless. Clouds hung low over the hills, and the sound of distant thunder rolled across the sky, but the storm was already brewing in the streets. Neighbors spoke openly now, no longer whispering, their voices carrying anger and energy that had been buried for years. They gathered in small groups near mailboxes, on porches, and at the cafe by the crossroads, their talk circling around one thing: the HOA president and her threat to strike back. Everyone knew she would not sit quietly after being embarrassed. Everyone knew she was planning something. At the clubhouse on the hill, the president summoned her remaining loyal board members again. This time she was not pacing in anger. She was cold and deliberate. The table was covered in documents, letters, legal notices, and a fresh complaint filed with the county. Her eyes gleamed with determination as she said, "If the community is starting to doubt me, we remind them what happens when they forget who is in charge. He thinks old deeds make him strong. But the law is about interpretation, and interpretation is mine to shape." One of the board members, a thin man with glasses, shifted uncomfortably. But the sheriff already saw his documents. They looked legitimate. She snapped her gaze to him, her voice cutting. Then we make them illegitimate. We file challenges. We flood him with lawsuits. We use zoning laws, environmental rules, permits he never applied for. We don't need to beat him with truth. We drown him with paper. The others nodded, some reluctantly, others eagerly, desperate to cling to the power she still exuded. By noon, envelopes began arriving at the cabin. Each one carried the HOA seal, each one filled with threats dressed as notices. Violation of community bylaws, unauthorized use of land, illegal fencing, unapproved chimney design. The neighbors saw the delivery and gasped. "She's attacking him already," one whispered. "She's trying to bury him alive." The man accepted each envelope calmly, stacking them on his table beside the leather folder of deeds. He opened one, read it slowly, then placed it back in the pile. His wife stood nearby, her face pale. "How many will she send?" she asked. He met her eyes, his calm unshaken. "As many as she has left in her hand. But paper cannot erase stone, and stone is what the land is built on." That evening, the president made her next move. She called the police again, not just one officer this time, but a pair of squad cars that rolled up the gravel road toward the cabin. Neighbors stepped outside at once, their lanterns swinging, forming a quiet wall of bodies along the street. The president marched behind the officers, her voice loud and commanding. "This man is squatting on illegal property. His documents are forgeries. He is a danger to the community, and I demand his removal tonight." The officers listened, their faces unreadable. One approached the man, who stood calmly on his porch, the lantern light flickering behind him. "Sir," the officer said evenly, "we've received complaints again. They're claiming you're occupying land unlawfully." The man reached for the leather folder without hurry, handing it over like a ritual. The officer flipped through it, his eyes narrowing at the seals, the signatures, the maps. He glanced at his partner, then back at the president. "These look authentic," he said. The president's face flushed deep red. "Authentic? Anyone can print fake seals. Anyone can forge a map. You are failing in your duty if you believe this nonsense." Her shrill voice cut through the night, but the neighbors didn't flinch anymore. Some even laughed bitterly, their courage emboldened. One called out, "We've seen the papers too. They are real." Another added, "He owns more than you ever did." The crowd grew louder, their voices layering into something unstoppable. The officers exchanged glances, then stepped back. One said firmly, "This isn't something we can settle at a doorstep. If you believe there's fraud, take it to court. But for now, he stays." The president's mouth opened, then closed, her words trapped behind her teeth. She turned in fury, pointing a shaking finger at the man. "Enjoy your little moment," she spat. "When I'm finished with you, you won't just lose this cabin, you'll lose everything." She stormed back to her car, her board members trailing behind like shadows with no strength of their own. The neighbors erupted into cheers the moment her car disappeared down the road. They clapped, they shouted, they hugged one another. For years, they had never raised their voices against her, but tonight they sounded like thunder rolling through the valley. The man did not smile, but he nodded once, acknowledging their support. He knew the battle was not over. She would drag him into court, twist the law, and fight with everything she had left. But he also knew something she did not. The people were no longer afraid. Later that night, the man sat at his table with his wife and children. The stack of false violations sat untouched, while the leather folder rested open, its maps spread wide. His wife touched the edge of one document gently. "She won't stop," she said softly. He looked at her, his calm steady as stone. "Then neither will I. She fights with fear. I fight with truth. Fear burns quickly. Truth does not." His children leaned against him, comforted by the warmth in his voice. Outside, the neighbors lit lanterns again, lining them along the path, their glow casting long golden lines across the dark. They weren't just symbols anymore, they were shields, a sign that the community stood with him. The president could file lawsuits, could shout, could threaten, but she could not erase the light spreading through the valley. The land was his, But more importantly, the people were finally his allies. The storm she was summoning in court would be fierce, but when it broke, she would be the one standing alone. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and old paper, a place where echoes of voices seemed to cling to the walls long after they were gone. On the morning of the hearing, the benches were filled before the gavel ever struck. Neighbors who had once avoided the HOA meetings out of fear now crowded the courtroom, whispering to one another, their eyes filled with determination. Reporters lined the back wall, cameras flashing, pens scribbling. Everyone knew this was no ordinary dispute. This was the moment the entire valley would discover who truly owned the land they called home. The HOA president swept in with her lawyer at her side, her heels clicking against the stone floor. She wore her finest navy suit, her hair fixed in a perfect twist, her smile painted but brittle. She looked around the room, sneering at the neighbors who dared to gather against her, then set her eyes on the man seated at the front. He sat quietly with his wife and children beside him, the leather folder resting on the table like a weapon stronger than any she carried. His calmness unnerved her. She wanted him rattled, broken, but his steady presence made her grind her teeth. The judge entered, stern and silent, and the gavel struck once, demanding order. The HOA lawyer rose first, his voice smooth but cold. He painted the man as a fraud, a squatter hiding behind old papers that meant nothing in the modern world. He waved documents of his own, community bylaws, zoning ordinances, photographs of the cabin, each one delivered with practiced confidence. Your Honor, he said firmly, this individual has manipulated outdated records to claim ownership of property that belongs to the community. He endangers the very structure of our HOA, which has governed this valley for decades. If he succeeds, he destroys everything. The president nodded proudly, her smug smile returning as the lawyer spoke. She leaned toward her board members, whispering, "See? This is how power speaks." But her confidence wavered when the Attorney General rose next. He had come himself, drawn by the gravity of the case, and his presence filled the room. He carried the leather folder in his hands, placed it on the judge's bench, and opened it slowly. His voice was deep and clear, every word striking like a hammer. What this board calls outdated records are, in fact, original deeds. Signed, sealed, and recorded. They do not represent manipulation. They represent truth. He spread the pages across the bench for the judge to see. Maps traced in ink, seals pressed into parchment, signatures from generations past. The judge leaned forward, studying them with care, nodding slowly as he turned each page. Murmurs rose from the benches as neighbors leaned in, recognizing landmarks, seeing familiar names. The Attorney General lifted one map high enough for all to see. This document proves, he said, his voice cutting through the noise, that the land this cabin stands on, and much more, belongs to the family of this man. Not the HOA. Not the president. Him. Gasps filled the room. The neighbors erupted into whispers that quickly grew into angry shouts against the president. "You lied to us," one woman cried. "You stole from us," shouted another. The judge struck his gavel sharply, restoring order, but the energy in the room could not be contained again. The president's face turned pale, her lawyer stumbling over his words, scrambling to argue. "These documents are ancient, irrelevant," he stammered. No one could possibly believe. The Attorney General cut him off, his voice like stone. "The law does not vanish because of age. If it did, none of you would stand here today. These papers are binding, and your board has abused its authority for years, hiding behind fear." The judge turned to the neighbors. "Does anyone here wish to give testimony?" Dozens of hands rose at once. One by one, people stepped forward. An elderly man described losing his savings to endless fines for his shutters. A mother wept as she told how her children cried when their toys were seized. A young couple explained how they were nearly forced from their home over false violations. Each voice built upon the last, a tide of truth washing over the lies. The president sat stiffly, her knuckles white against the table, her smile long gone. Finally, the man was called. He walked to the stand slowly, his boots steady against the floor, his calm presence filling the space. He looked at the judge, then at the neighbors, then at the president. "I built my cabin with my own hands," he said quietly but firmly. "They came not because it broke rules, but because I refused to bow. They destroyed what they could not control. But this land is not theirs to command. It has been mine longer than their board has existed, and no threat, no fine, no false notice will change that. I do not stand here just for myself. I stand for every family they made afraid. And I will not leave." The courtroom burst into applause, neighbors rising to their feet, their cheers echoing through the chamber. The judge struck his gavel again, but this time he did not hide the faint nod of respect on his face. The president shouted above the noise, her voice shrill, "This is a circus. He is nothing. I am the law here." But no one listened. Her words fell flat, drowned by the voices of the people she once ruled. The gavel came down hard. "Enough," the judge said. "This court will reconvene tomorrow for a ruling." The room erupted again, neighbors embracing one another, reporters rushing to capture every word. The president stormed out, her heels clattering, her face twisted with fury. But her power was crumbling, and she knew it. The man returned to his family, his calm eyes meeting theirs, and whispered, "It has begun." That night, lanterns glowed brighter than ever across the valley, each one a symbol of hope. The president planned her next move in darkness, but the light of the people was spreading, and nothing could snuff it out. The courthouse emptied slowly after the first day of hearings, but the valley did not sleep. Lanterns glowed on porches, voices rose in the cafe late into the night, and everywhere people repeated the same words, "She's losing. He's winning." 4 years, the HOA president's voice had been law, but now the balance was tilting, and it terrified her more than she could admit. In her grand house at the edge of the resort, she paced furiously, her heels striking the hardwood floor. The board members sat stiffly around her dining table, too afraid to speak. Finally, she slammed her hand on the table and hissed, "If we let him stand, we are finished. Do you understand? He will not only keep that cabin, he will own us." Her eyes burned with a wild light. "Tomorrow, I end this." The board members glanced at one another nervously, but one finally asked, "How?" She leaned forward, lowering her voice to a whisper filled with venom. "If the law starts to slip away, then we use fear again. I'll call inspectors, claim his cabin is unsafe. I'll say his chimney leaks gas, that his well water is poisoned, that his land is a danger to the valley itself. If truth fails, lies will serve." Her smile twisted, cruel and desperate. "By the time he proves me wrong, the people will be too exhausted to fight for him." Morning came heavy with clouds, the courthouse steps crowded before the doors opened. Neighbors gathered with determination, their faces grim but hopeful. The man arrived with his wife and children, his leather folder tucked under his arm. He looked calm, though he had slept little, his mind steady like the stone hills surrounding the valley. He knew she would not give up without striking again. As he walked up the courthouse steps, neighbors reached out, touching his arm, whispering, "We're with you, and stand strong." He nodded to each, saying only, "The truth stands longer than lies." Inside, the president arrived with a new stack of documents, her lawyer carrying them like weapons. She stood tall, her smile restored, her voice sharp as she addressed the judge. "Your Honor, last night we received new reports from county inspectors. This cabin is unsafe. Its well contaminates the valley's water. Its foundation violates safety standards. It is not only illegal, it is dangerous." She waved the papers like banners of war, her eyes flashing triumphantly at the man across the room. Neighbors gasped, whispers filling the benches. Had she truly uncovered something, or was this just another trick? The judge lifted the papers, scanning them carefully. His brow furrowed. The Attorney General stood at once. "Your Honor," he said firmly, "we request verification. These so-called reports were created in the dead of night. We must ask, who ordered them?" All eyes turned to the president. She stiffened, then smiled faintly, too faintly. "The county responded to community concerns," she said smoothly. But the courtroom had already shifted. The neighbors began murmuring louder, realizing what had happened. One stood up. "We never filed those concerns." Another added, "No inspector came to our homes. She forged them." The crowd's voices grew stronger, their anger echoing off the walls. The judge struck the gavel hard. "Order!" His voice cut the noise, but the damage to her credibility was done. He fixed her with a cold stare. "If you brought false evidence into this court, you will answer for it." Her face drained of color, but she forced her smile again, though her hands trembled. The man rose slowly, his calm steady as stone. He spoke not to the judge, but to the people. "Do you see? Every time the truth shines, she hides it under new lies. She fined you for flowers, for shutters, for toys, and when that was not enough, she tore down what she could not control. And now she brings false reports to destroy me. But the land does not lie. The documents do not lie. She is the lie." His voice carried through the chamber, steady, clear, undeniable. The neighbors erupted, their voices uniting in support. Some clapped, others shouted, their courage filling the room. The president tried to shout over them, her voice shrill, desperate. "Silence! You fools! You don't understand. Without me, this valley will fall into chaos." But no one listened. Even her own board members shifted away from her, their eyes downcast. The spell she had cast for years was broken. The community was no longer afraid. The judge banged the gavel again, his face stern. "Enough. This court will examine these new documents for authenticity. But let it be clear, manipulation will not save anyone here. The ruling comes tomorrow morning." His words struck like thunder. The president sank into her chair, her shoulders shaking, her eyes darting wildly around the room. For the first time, she looked not powerful but cornered. When the court adjourned, the man stepped outside with his family. The neighbors gathered close, their lanterns waiting to be lit for another night of unity. A reporter shouted, "Do you think she's finished?" The man looked out over the valley, calm and steady. "Fear always returns for one more fight," he said quietly. "But when the truth rises, fear has nowhere left to hide." That night, as darkness fell, lanterns glowed once more across the valley. The neighbors stood together, shoulder to shoulder, their fear gone, their unity stronger than ever. The president watched from her window at the resort, her hands trembling on the curtain. For the first time in her reign, she realized she was alone. The courthouse was overflowing the next morning, every bench filled, the aisles crowded, people pressed against the back wall just to catch a glimpse of what would happen. The tension in the air was so heavy it seemed to bend the very rafters. Reporters whispered into their microphones, cameras clicked, and neighbors who had once lived in silence now spoke openly, their voices low but strong. Everyone knew the truth was close, and everyone knew the president's mask was slipping. She entered the courtroom late, her steps quicker than usual, her smile thinner, her papers clutched too tightly in her hands. Her lawyer followed with a strained expression, carrying the stack of reports she had forged, reports that already smelled of lies. She looked around the room, searching for fear in the neighbors' faces, but instead found steady eyes and quiet defiance. Her gaze landed on the man seated at the front with his wife and children beside him, the leather folder resting calmly on the table as if it were waiting for the right moment to close this battle forever. His calmness made her grind her teeth. The judge entered, gavel in hand, and the room hushed instantly. His eyes swept over the crowd, then landed on the pile of documents the president had presented the day before. He spoke slowly, his voice heavy. "We have examined the new reports submitted. They are not genuine. They were created without authorization, without inspection, and without truth." Gasps filled the courtroom, neighbors turning to one another, anger flashing in their eyes. The president's face drained of color, her mouth opening as if to argue, but the judge continued. "This court does not take kindly to false evidence. Consider this your warning. You are walking a dangerous path." The neighbors erupted, some clapping, others shouting in disbelief that she had stooped so low. The judge struck the gavel for silence, but the energy could not be fully contained. The Attorney General stood next, his tall frame commanding the room. Your Honor, this proves what we have said all along. This board does not seek justice or order, it seeks control through fear and lies. The people of this valley have been abused long enough. He gestured toward the crowd. Let them speak. Let their voices show what has been stolen from them. The judge nodded. One by one, neighbors rose to testify. A mother told of how she had been fined for letting her children chalk drawings on the sidewalk. An elderly woman described how her garden, her pride and joy, was torn out by HOA order. A young couple spoke about the nights they cried, afraid they would lose their home over invented violations. Their voices shook with emotion, but their courage filled the room with power. Each story was another crack in the president's armor. Each confession another nail in the coffin of her rule. The president slammed her hand on the table, shouting, "Lies! All of it! They are ungrateful. Without me, this community would fall apart." But her voice was drowned out by the crowd. The neighbors stood together, their voices rising as one, no longer whispers but thunder. No more fines, they cried. No more fear. The courtroom shook with their unity. The man rose slowly, his calm presence silencing even the noise of the crowd. He turned to the neighbors, his voice steady, carrying through every corner of the room. You have spoken, and the truth is clear. For years she made you bow your heads. For years she made you doubt yourselves. But today, you stood. Today, you said no more. He paused, his eyes locking on the president. She thought the valley belonged to her. But it belongs to us. And it always has. The neighbors cheered again, louder than ever, tears shining in their eyes as they clapped and shouted. The president's face twisted in rage. She pointed a shaking finger at the man. You think this is over? You think they will follow you? You are nothing without me. Her voice cracked, shrill, desperate. Even her own lawyer leaned away from her, ashamed. The judge's gavel struck hard, echoing like thunder. Enough. Sit down. The room fell into silence, but it was a silence charged with victory. Everyone could see it now. The president was finished. Her words no longer commanded fear. Her power no longer reached into their homes. The neighbors looked at her not as their ruler, but as a woman exposed, desperate, clinging to control that was already gone. She sank into her chair, trembling, her eyes darting as if searching for escape. The man sat again, his wife squeezing his hand, his children smiling faintly, sensing the shift. The leather folder sat closed now, its work done. The truth had spoken louder than the lies. The valley was no longer under her shadow. The judge cleared his throat, his eyes stern. Tomorrow morning, this court will give its final ruling. Until then, I suggest everyone prepare for the truth. As the gavel struck and the room adjourned, the neighbors did not leave quietly. They left together, their voices carrying through the halls, chanting, "No more fear. No more fear." The president stumbled out a side door, her face hidden, her power shattered. The man walked into the sunlight with his family, greeted by neighbors who clapped his shoulder, shook his hand, and smiled through tears. That night, lanterns lined the valley once more, brighter than ever, their glow stretching into the sky like stars declaring freedom was near. The night before the verdict, the valley was restless. No one slept easily. Curtains glowed with lamplight late into the hours, neighbors speaking in hushed tones around their tables, wondering what the morning would bring. Children sensed the tension and clung to their parents, asking questions they could not answer. At the cabin, the man sat by the fire with his wife and children close. The leather folder rested on the table beside him, worn from use but still whole, its seals strong, its maps intact. His wife reached for his hand, her voice low. "Tomorrow it ends," she whispered. He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the flames. Tomorrow the truth speaks, and fear has no voice left. At the resort, the HOA president paced her office like a caged animal. The grand windows reflected her anxious shadow. Her papers scattered across the desk, her hands trembling as she tried to prepare. For the first time, she was not rehearsing victory speeches but muttering desperate excuses. Her lawyer sat across from her, exhausted, rubbing his temples. "You need to be careful tomorrow," he warned. "The judge has no patience left." She spun on him, her eyes blazing. "Careful? If I lose tomorrow, I lose everything. The resort, the board, the valley. He will own it all." Her voice cracked on the last word, and for the first time, fear crept into her tone. She sank into her chair, clutching the edges of her desk as if the wood itself might hold her together. Morning came with heavy clouds pressing low over the hills, the courthouse buzzing like a hive. Reporters crowded the steps, cameras flashing, microphones ready. Neighbors poured in by the dozens, their faces grim but hopeful, determined to see justice served. The man arrived quietly with his family, walking through the crowd that parted for him with respect. Children waved, women nodded, men clapped him on the shoulder. He carried the folder in one hand, steady and sure, as though it weighed nothing at all. His calm presence spread through the people like a quiet fire, steadying their nerves. The president arrived soon after, stepping out of her black car with her chin high, her smile forced but brittle. The crowd did not lower their eyes this time. Some booed softly, others crossed their arms and glared. She tried to stride past them with her old authority, but each step felt heavier under their judgment. Her lawyer trailed behind, carrying stacks of papers that no longer inspired fear. Inside, the courtroom was louder than before, filled to its very walls. The judge entered, his gavel striking for order, and the noise fell into silence. His eyes were tired but sharp, his patience clearly thin. "Today," he began, "this court delivers judgment. But before I speak, both sides will be heard one final time." The HOA lawyer rose first, his voice strained, his arguments weaker than they had ever been. He repeated the same lines. The man's deeds were old, irrelevant, dangerous to modern order. He tried to frame the HOA as protectors of the valley, claiming that without their rules, chaos would reign. But the neighbors murmured in disagreement, shaking their heads, their eyes full of memory and pain. The words no longer held them. Then the Attorney General stood. His voice was strong, filling every corner of the chamber. He lifted the leather folder high, then placed it on the judge's bench. "Your Honor, this is not simply about one cabin. It is about an entire valley held hostage by lies. These deeds are real. These rights are legal. And this man," he gestured toward the man, who sat calmly, hands folded, "has done what no one else dared. He stood against tyranny when everyone else was too afraid. That is not chaos. That is justice." The crowd erupted in cheers before the judge's gavel restored order. Finally, the man himself rose. He did not shout, did not raise his hands. He simply spoke in his calm, steady voice. "For years, we lived in fear. Every letter on our doors, every fine, every threat, made us smaller. They told us we did not belong on the land where we raised our children, where we built our lives. But this land was never theirs to rule. It was always ours. And fear ends here." His words cut through the silence like steel. Even the judge leaned forward, his expression softening. The president leapt to her feet, her voice shrill, desperate. "He lies. He tricks you all. Without me, this valley will fall into ruin." She pointed wildly at the neighbors. "You need me. You always needed me." But her words were drowned by the people rising together, their voices strong, "No more. No more." The chant shook the walls of the courtroom, a tide of defiance that could not be silenced. The judge struck the gavel again, but this time even he did not fully quiet them. He looked at the president, then at the man, then at the people who filled his courtroom to the brim. "Enough," he said firmly. "The ruling will be delivered tomorrow morning." His eyes burned with finality. "And the truth will end this." As the gavel struck and the session closed, the neighbors poured out into the street, chanting, cheering, crying. Reporters swarmed them, capturing the energy of a community on the edge of freedom. The president slipped out a side door, her head down, her shoulders hunched. For the first time in years, she was no longer feared. She was pitied. The man returned to his cabin that night, his children laughing softly, his wife holding his hand. The valley glowed with lanterns brighter than stars, their light stretching across the dark hills. Tomorrow the verdict would come, and everyone knew the truth was ready to speak louder than fear had ever dared. The courthouse was silent the next morning, though outside it sounded like a festival of nerves. Reporters lined the steps, neighbors packed the sidewalks, and lanterns from the night before still hung in windows like watchful eyes. Everyone knew today was the end. Inside, the benches overflowed, people standing shoulder to shoulder, their breath held as if the walls themselves might speak. The man sat at the front with his wife and children, the leather folder on the table before him. His hands rested calmly over it, his expression steady, though his heart pounded with the weight of years. Across the aisle, the HOA president sat stiff, her face painted with a smile that fooled no one. Her lawyer whispered urgently in her ear, but she only stared straight ahead, her knuckles white against the table. The judge entered, robe flowing, gavel in hand. The room dropped into silence. His eyes scanned the crowded chamber, then rested on the man, the president, and finally the people who had gathered with their stories, their pain, their hope. He struck the gavel once, the sound sharp as thunder. This court has heard enough. Today, judgment is given. The hush deepened, breaths caught, eyes fixed. The judge began slowly, his voice heavy with the weight of what had been revealed. For years, this community has been governed by rules. Rules can be good when they protect, but they can also be twisted into weapons. We have heard testimony of fear, fines, and threats. We have seen false evidence brought into this very room. And we have read deeds that do not lie. He lifted the leather folder, placing it firmly on the bench. These documents are valid. They prove ownership of the valley belongs not to the board, but to the man seated here. Gasps rippled through the room. Some cried, some clapped before catching themselves, but the judge raised his hand and continued. This court finds that the HOA president abused her authority. She used fear to control instead of law to guide. She is hereby removed from her position, and the HOA is dissolved effective immediately. The gavel struck again, final and loud. This valley is free. The courtroom erupted. Neighbors leapt to their feet, clapping, shouting, some with tears streaming down their faces. They embraced one another, their joy echoing louder than any fine, louder than any threat they had ever endured. The president jumped up, her chair crashing to the floor. "This is madness," she shrieked, her voice shrill. "You can't do this. Without me, you'll destroy yourselves." She lunged toward the bench, but officers stepped forward, their hands firm as they blocked her path. Her lawyer backed away, shaking his head, unwilling to be dragged down any further. The president's voice cracked into desperation. "You fools! You'll regret this. You need me." But her words were drowned out by the thunder of the people's voices. The man rose slowly, turning to face the neighbors. They quieted as his calm voice carried through the chamber. "You do not need fear. You do not need rulers who steal your peace. You have each other. This valley belongs to all of us, not to one voice, not to one board, but to the people who call it home." The neighbors erupted once more, their cheers shaking the very walls. The judge himself allowed a faint nod of approval, his gavel resting at last. Outside, the courthouse steps turned into celebration. Reporters shouted questions, microphones pushed forward, but the neighbors formed a circle around the man and his family, protecting them, lifting their voices higher than the noise of the press. Lanterns that had burned through the night were carried into the street, glowing even in daylight, symbols of victory. Children laughed, elders wept, and for the first time in years, the valley felt free. The president was escorted down the steps by officers, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. People did not move aside for her this time. They turned their backs, refusing to look at her, refusing to give her the power of attention. She stumbled into her car, her empire shattered, her crown of fear turned to dust. The man stood on the steps, his wife's hand in his children at his side. A reporter managed to push through and asked, "What will you do now that you own the valley?" He looked out over the sea of neighbors, their lanterns glowing, their faces shining with hope. His voice was calm, steady, the same voice that had stood against fear from the beginning. "I will not rule it," he said. "I will guard it. The valley belongs to its people, and together we will keep it free." The crowd roared, chanting his words, their unity shaking the air. That night, lanterns burned brighter than ever, lining the roads, glowing in windows, reflected in the half-drained lake. The valley was free, and no board, no president, no fear would ever rule it again. That night the valley felt different than it had in years. The courthouse was behind them, the verdict sealed, the fear broken. Lanterns glowed along every porch, every path, every trail, their warm light flickering like stars fallen to the earth. Families who once stayed hidden behind curtains now walked freely, laughing, speaking loudly, no longer afraid of who might hear. Children ran barefoot through the grass, their shouts filling the evening air, their parents smiling without the weight of fines or threats pressing on their backs. For the first time in a long time, the valley breathed freely. At the cabin, the man sat on his porch with his wife and children. The leather folder lay on the table beside him, closed now, its work finished. His wife leaned against him, her hand resting on his arm, her voice soft. "It's over," she whispered. He nodded slowly, his eyes drifting over the lanterns glowing across the valley. "It's over for her," he said gently. "But for us, it is only beginning." His children curled against him, their small voices excited as they asked questions about the future. He smiled faintly, the calm never leaving his eyes. "The valley is ours now," he told them. "Not mine alone. Ours." Across the lake, the resort stood in silence. Its lights were dim, its once proud docks empty, its halls echoing with nothing but the memory of parties and arrogance. The president was gone, driven out by the very people she had ruled. No more letters taped to doors, no more threats whispered in hallways, no more fines that stripped joy from simple lives. The neighbors no longer looked at the resort with envy or fear. They looked at it as a relic, a reminder of chains they had broken together. The community gathered at the cabin later that night. Old men with weathered hands, mothers with children in their arms, young couples who once feared losing their homes, all came carrying food, lanterns, and music. They sat around the fire, telling stories not of fear, but of freedom. One neighbor stood and raised his lantern high. "For years we lived in silence," he said, his voice trembling. "But tonight, we speak with one voice. No more fear. No more lies. The valley is ours." The crowd roared with cheers, their voices rising into the night sky like a song. The man listened, his calm eyes reflecting the firelight. He did not raise his voice above theirs, did not seek to command. Instead, when the noise softened, he spoke simply. "This land was given to me by blood and time. But land is only stone and soil if it does not serve the people. You are its heart. Without you, it means nothing. Together, we will guard it, and together, we will live free." His words were met with applause so loud it shook the trees. As the night deepened, music rose from the gathering. Someone played a fiddle, children clapped, families danced in the grass. The fire crackled high, sparks leaping toward the stars. The valley, once ruled by silence and fear, now pulsed with life and laughter. Even the river seemed to run louder, its waters free, as if the land itself had been waiting for this moment. Later, when the crowd drifted home, the man walked to the edge of the valley. The moonlight spread silver across the hills, the lanterns glowing like constellations below. He thought of the bridge that had been destroyed, the threats at his door, the lies in the courtroom. He thought of the neighbors who once hid in fear but now stood tall. He felt the weight of the past lift from his shoulders, replaced by something stronger, hope. His wife joined him, slipping her hand into his. "Do you regret anything?" she asked quietly. He shook his head, his calm voice steady. Only that it took so long for the valley to find its voice. Together they walked back to the cabin, their children already asleep inside, their home glowing warmly in the dark. The leather folder still lay on the table, a symbol of truth that had broken chains. But he knew the real strength was not in the papers. It was in the people, in their courage, in the unity they had reclaimed. As dawn crept over the hills the next morning, the valley woke not to fear but to freedom. Neighbors greeted one another with smiles, doors wide open, laughter spilling across yards. The man stood on his porch, watching the sun rise over the land that had been fought for and finally won. His eyes were calm, his heart steady. The valley belonged to its people again, and no president, no board, no fear would ever take it from them.